Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and we are going to look at a lecture that will introduce the canonical gospels. The word canon refers to the rule or the standard, and there are, of course, other gospels that are not viewed as canonical. That doesn't change their historical importance, but the church does not consider them, or Christians, I should say, does not consider them to be canonical or divinely inspired. But again, that doesn't change their historical importance. But regardless of which, there are four canonical gospels. You have essentially Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what we're really going to be looking at here is more the relationship between the synoptic gospels. And the word synoptic refers to similar, and those gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we're going to start off here with the four source theory, and I do have to apologize if you happen to hear any construction noise around me in this lecture. I can hear construction work taking place outside. I've tried to close off my area as much as possible, but I can still hear the sound of a jackhammer, but I'm doing the best I can to try and keep the noise out. But the four source theory, it's the dominant theory to explain the relationship between the synoptic or similar gospels. And of course, again, the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're very, very similar in terms of their story, their rhetoric. And the four source theory, it's the dominant theory to explain the relationship between the synoptic gospels. And I would say that most that of New Testament historians, the four source theory would be held by 90 to 95%. So pretty high. But what exactly is the four source theory? Well, this is quite a bit of text here, but the four source theory, it states that Mark's gospel was written first and that Matthew and Luke used the gospel of Mark as a source along with a hypothetical document that's known as Q or QL. The word QL refers to the source in German, and whatever personal information that they had. You have the M source for Matthew and then the L source for Luke to produce their gospels, and then the Gospel of John forms a much later tradition. Okay, this is the dominant view. How is this explained? Well, starts off with Mark being given the priority. It's the priority source. Why is it viewed as the priority source? Well, for one, it has the lowest Christology. And let me give an example to explain that, although this will certainly come up when we, get more into the canonical gospels. But consider, for example, Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, John the Baptizer. In the Gospel of Mark, when John the Baptist, is preaching this message of repentance for sins, Jesus comes out and he's baptized by John. Well, if that was all the information that you had, it would seem as though Jesus was someone who committed sins and he came out and he's baptized by John. Well, compare that same event to the gospel in the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus approaches John the Baptizer, and asks to be baptized, John, his response is, baptize you, you should baptize me. To which Jesus responds back essentially, yes, but for the sake of righteousness, let's do it this way. Well, that's a higher Christology right there. And John's gospel, the Gospel of John, I will admit it has the highest of all of the four. It has the highest Christology. Okay, so that's one issue for why Mark is held to be first. But another reason for why it's held to be first is because in Matthew and Luke, you have where Mark's gospel is essentially quoted verbatim, that is, word for word, or very close to it. And to give an example of explaining that, in one of the classrooms I used to teach in, and I give this as an example for what's known as individual relativity, Let's say that we witnessed an event that took place in the parking lot, and then we are asked about it later. It is normal for there to be some variety in what we saw. But if we are giving verbatim the exact same story, that's a big red flare for people in law enforcement because it comes across as though somebody was being coached into what to say. Well, in the case with Matthew and Luke and Mark, Mark is quoted verbatim or very close to it. So, what that means is that Mark's gospel was essentially in front of Matthew and Luke when they produced their gospels, and Matthew and Luke use Mark's gospel as a source, along with this hypothetical document known as QL, or the source in German, and then whatever personal information that they had. You have the M source for Matthew and the L source for Luke. Okay, that's the dominant view. And like I said, that view would be held by about 90 to 95% of New Testament historians. But what about those that are in the 5 to 10 percentage range that don't agree with the four source theory? Well, for them, you have what's called the two gospel hypothesis. Well, the two gospel hypothesis is a minority view to explain the relationship between the synoptic gospels, which of course are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But those who argue in favor of it do so in part because of the QL document. It's not solely because of the QL document, but the QL document is one major factor. Why would it be a major factor? Well, the QL document, or Q for short, it's a hypothetical document, so it may not even exist. And basically, these historians, they want something that we have a documented evidence of. Like in the case of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, yeah, we have the evidence of them right there. It's right there in front of us. We have it. Whereas with QL, we don't have that. Although some historians have tried to reconstruct it based on what's in Matthew and Luke. But essentially, from this point of view, from the two gospel hypothesis, Matthew was written first, and then Luke used Matthew as a source, and then Mark used both Matthew and Luke as sources, and then the Gospel of John forms a much later tradition. Okay, so that is the two gospel hypothesis. Well, what arguments are made in favor of this, particularly, Matthew being the priority gospel? What arguments are made there? Well, for one, Matthew certainly has a lot of pro-Jewish overtones. And of course, Jesus and his earliest followers were all Jewish. So that's one reason why. And also, you do have within history, the history of the Christian faith coming from the church fathers that argue that Matthew um, actually was at one time written in Hebrew, or if not Hebrew, Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus and his early followers spoke. And then it was later um, translated into Greek. And you do have within the church fathers a notion that Matthew was also written first. So, what are some arguments that are made against that? Well, arguably, the biggest argument that's made against that by historians that disagree is that, the church fathers in this case were just mistaken. And they could have been wrong. Certainly they could have. But one thing I will mention with a lot of historians, in this case regarding the church fathers, is that a lot of them just seem to like to completely disregard them, saying that they just have it wrong. when that's not really completely, a valid excuse. Now, here is perhaps a more stronger argument against the two gospel hypothesis. Okay, Matthew being written first, it's given priority. Okay, then Luke uses Matthew as a source, and then Mark, by contrast, uses both Matthew and Luke as sources. Well, why then does Mark have a lower Christology? Why, for example, in the story with Jesus' baptism by John, does Mark remove what you find in Matthew? The whole baptize you, you should baptize me. Mark doesn't have that. Why would he get rid of it? And that's just one example. There are other examples that can be given. That's just one. Well, the response seems to be to that essentially Mark is writing an abridged version. So he cut out a lot of information to produce his gospel. But that leads into a question, well, why would he do that? So, well, I think that we will stop here at this moment, but there is another point to mention with giving the introduction to the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.